Do you love cars? Do you love cars almost as much as you love rodents? Well, I have the perfect commander deck for you. If you weren't content to just slam big cars, trains, and planes into your opponent's faces, now you can do so while abusing your graveyard at the same time in true Orzhov fashion with Greasefang Okiba Boss. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and this channel is all about unconventional commander decks and strategies. Now, before we get started, don't forget to join us on Discord, where we discuss unique ways to play in Magic the Gathering's best format, or maybe you can even play some games. You can find the invite link to the Discord server in the description, and the server is open to everyone. And if you like what this channel is all about, feel free to support the Commander's Beacon directly through Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons, you are awesome. Patrons get to vote on upcoming content, you can get access to patron-only discard channels and roles, and you can request your own custom deck build and more, all while supporting the channel, and you can find the Patreon link in the description. Alright, now let's move on with today's discussion. So I was getting ready to talk about a mono-blue ninja deck today, but ultimately I decided that the deck wasn't good enough, so instead we're going to talk about vehicles. But I will still be working on a Dimir Ninjas deck to take advantage of all the new ninjas in Kamigawa and Neon Dynasty, and it won't even be commanded by Yuriko. Now hopefully that episode will come out in a week or two, but for today let's talk about vehicles, which also just received a bunch of support in Kamigawa. So Greasefang Okiba Boss costs 1 white black. It's a rat pilot, which is already really awesome, and I don't understand why people don't adore rats the same way they do squirrels. Anyways, Greasefang is a 4/3 and it has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, return target vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, it gains haste. Return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So Greasefang is graveyard recursion for your vehicles. You'll benefit from self-mill effects to help you fill your graveyard with those vehicles. And a vehicle animated by Greasefang has haste, so it can attack right away. And because Greasefang has 4 power, she can crew most vehicles all by herself. In fact, of the 42 vehicles available to you in Orzhov colors, Greasefang can solo crew 38 of them. Also note that Greasefang is effectively saving you mana by reanimating those vehicles for you for free, effectively at 1 vehicle per turn. But there is still a cost. At the end of your turn, you need to return that reanimated vehicle to your hand, so if you want to use it again, you will need to spend the mana to cast it. Though there are some ways around that, which we'll discuss later. So with this deck, we're going to get vehicles into our graveyard. We'll reanimate those vehicles with Greasefang, do some damage, and then we might just sacrifice those vehicles instead of letting them return to our hand with Greasefang, so that we can reanimate them again next turn. And that's pretty much the strategy. We're going to smack people with vehicles, abuse our graveyard because our commander is Orzhov and it says vehicle on it, and we're going to do the Orzhov thing. So let's start by talking about the vehicles in this deck. Like we said, there are 42 vehicles available to an Orzhov deck in all of Magic. In this deck, we're playing 15 of them. We want to prioritize vehicles that give us some benefit when they enter the battlefield or attack, so that we can get value out of them right away when Greasefang reanimates them. Like Bomat Bazaar Barge, which is a 5/5 vehicle that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. And then Smuggler's Copter loots when it deals combat damage to a player, so you can always discard a vehicle from your hand that you can then reanimate later with Greasefang. There's Reckoner Bankbuster, which we might not even crew at all, since it enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters, and you can pay 2 and tap it and remove a charge counter from it to draw a card. Now I also like Aerial Surveyor, which flies, and it ramps a plains out of your deck when it attacks, if the defending player controls more lands than you. Now remember, if you've reanimated Aerial Surveyor with Greasefang, it will have haste, so it can attack right away. There's Imperial Recovery Unit, which also has an attack trigger. You get to return a creature or vehicle with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. Now there are only 4 vehicles in this deck that meet that mana requirement, and only 6 creatures, but this is still decent graveyard recursion on a vehicle body. Then there's also Colossal Plow with yet another attack trigger. It gives us 3 white mana and 3 life when it attacks, and that mana can be used until the end of the turn. Just be aware that it has a crew cost of 6, so Greasefang will need some help to crew it. Now let's talk about the new Surge Hacker mech, which has a very sweet enters the battlefield trigger to deal damage equal to twice the number of vehicles you control to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. So Surge Hacker mech is a great target to sacrifice and reanimate every single turn with Greasefang, and we'll talk about those sacrifice effects that we're using later. But for now, we've got even more vehicles. Like Enchanted Carriage, which makes 2 1/1 mouse tokens when it enters the battlefield, which again you might be able to sacrifice it and recur this every turn to make a decent number of tokens. But of course we really like Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. This vehicle is not new, but it is very excellent. This one deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls when it enters the battlefield or attacks, and you can do both in the same turn if you're reanimating Sky Sovereign with Greasefang. Now we'll round out our vehicle package with the Weatherlight, which has a combat damage trigger to help us find another artifact from among the top 5 cards of our library. Dermotaxi, I love the theme of this card, it's hilarious. It's Graveyard Hate, which can become a copy of whatever creature it exiles from a graveyard, but you do need to tap 2 creatures to crew it, so Greasefang can't do it by itself. And then there's Peace Walker Colossus, which can turn any other vehicle you control into a creature until end of turn for 1 and a white mana. And then Conqueror's Galleon is a 2/10 vampire conquistador warship from Ixalan that transforms at the end of combat after it attacks, and it transforms into Conqueror's Foothold, which can help you loot, draw, or recur things from your graveyard, though it does cost quite a bit of mana to activate for any of these modes. There's Cultivator's Caravan, which helps us ramp. And of course we're playing Parhelion 2, which costs 8 mana. It has Flying, First Strike, and Vigilance. It crews for 4, so Greasefang can crew it alone. And when Parhelion 2 attacks, you get to make 2 4/4 Angel tokens with Flying and Vigilance that are tapped and attacking. Now Parhelion 2 is definitely the biggest, face-smackiest vehicle in all of existence, and since Greasefang can bypass that high casting cost by reanimating it from our graveyard for free, we will start spamming those Angel tokens right away. So those are the vehicles in our deck. Again, there's only 15, but I think that's enough. First, because we can recur them from the graveyard, both with Greasefang and with some of the other cards in the deck. Secondly, because the more vehicles you have, the more pilots you'll need, so you do need to find a balance between the number of vehicles and the number of things that can crew those vehicles. And thirdly, again, I've tried to select specifically vehicles that give us some value right away, and there's a lot of very mediocre vehicles that I didn't want to include in this deck, because I wanted every time you reanimate something with Greasefang for it to be valuable for you. But now let's move on and discuss some of our vehicle support cards. Now Greasefang needs vehicles in the graveyard to reanimate them, so we'll use cards that tutor things into our graveyard to be reanimated with our commander. Entomb is the best example. For just a single black mana at instant speed, we can put any single card from our library into our graveyard. Violent Tumor is a 4-mana creature, and when it enters the battlefield, it entombs, so you, again, find something, whatever you want out of your library, put it into your graveyard. And Unmarked Grave is a 2-mana sorcerer that lets you search your library for a non-legendary card and put it into your graveyard, which unfortunately means you can't go get Parhelion 2 or Sky Sovereign because they're legendary, but you can get almost any other vehicle. Now there are other cards that let you tutor things from your library into your graveyard. I've chosen not to include any of the others just because the mana cost tends to be a bit higher, but if you really wanted to lean into that effect, there are other cards that do this for you that you could include as well. Now we will also use some smaller synergistic spells that help us put vehicles in the graveyard in their own way, like Bitter Revelation, Dark Bargain, and Moonlight Bargain. These are all card advantage spells that let us look at the top 4 or 5 cards of our library, and then we get to put some of those cards into our hand and the rest into our graveyard. So these can help us pull vehicles off the top of our library and put them into our graveyard to reanimate with Greasefang. Now remember that any vehicle that Greasefang reanimates will be returned to our hand at the end of the turn. This means we'll need to recast it on our next turn, and it won't even have haste, so it can't attack. This is obviously not ideal. Now you could use blink effects on your vehicles to make them permanently stay on the battlefield, or you could take even more drastic measures But instead in this deck, we're going to use sacrifice effects to turn those vehicles into value and put them back into our graveyard where Greasefang can reanimate them again next turn. And there are some powerful sacrifice effects. Ghoul-Caller Gisa, for example, can pay black and tap and sacrifice another creature to create X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens where X is the sacrificed creature's power. Most vehicles in this deck have 3 to 6 power or so, so you'll get a decent number of zombies this way, either to attack your opponents to death with or to help crew your vehicles. There's the new Ruthless Technomancer, a 4-mana creature with an ETB that lets you sacrifice another creature, and if you do, you make a number of treasure tokens equal to its power. Now, Ruthless Technomancer can also use those treasures too. You can pay 2 and a black and sacrifice X artifacts to return a target creature card with power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, Ruthless Technomancer only gets to sacrifice an animated vehicle once, when it enters the battlefield, but it's still a really powerful ability, and so it's in the deck. As is Disciple of Bolas, another 4-mana creature with an ETB that lets you sacrifice a creature, and when you do, you draw X cards and gain X life, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. But we've got even more sacrifice outlets that give us decent value from our vehicles, based either on their power or their mana value. Souldevi Adnate can tap and sacrifice a black creature or an artifact creature to make black equal to that creature's mana value. And Morbid Curiosity is a 3-mana sorcery that has, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, and you draw cards equal to the mana value of the sacrificed permanent. Now we have other smaller sacrifice effects too, just to help ensure that we can get our vehicles back into the graveyard where Greasefang can reanimate them. Reckoner's Bargain and Deadly Dispute are instants that let us sacrifice an artifact or a creature as an additional cost to cast them, so you can sacrifice a crewed or uncrewed vehicle, and then you draw a couple of cards. There's Rite of Oblivion, which is a decent removal spell. Unfortunately, it's a sorcery, so that's not great. But for just 2 mana and sacrificing a non-land permanent as an additional cost, you get to exile any target non-land permanent, and it has flashback for 2 white-black. There's Hidden Stockpile, which is a 2-mana enchantment with Revolt. At the end of your turn, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, you get to make a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. Now with all of our sacrifice effects, or even with Greasefang's bounce effect, this should trigger most turns. But if for some reason it doesn't, Hidden Stockpile also lets you pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to scry 1, and that will, trigger itself. And now we'll also use some other cards that help support our vehicles. We've got other pilots like Gearshift Ace. When it crews a vehicle, that vehicle gets first strike until end of turn. Kitsune Ace is mostly an upgrade. It's also 2 mana, and it has whenever a vehicle you control attacks, you choose one. Notice this triggers for each vehicle you attack with. Anyways, you can either give that vehicle first strike until end of turn, or untap Kitsune Ace. And then there's Aeronaut Admiral, which gives all of your vehicles flying. And of course we'll use True Conviction, which gives all of our crewed vehicles, and well, all of our other creatures as well, a nice permanent double strike and lifelink, which will really help pump up our vehicle's potency. And that's important because our primary win condition in this deck is hitting people in the face with vehicles. And then finally we have some other recursion pieces in the deck to help get our vehicles back out of the graveyard if Greasefang isn't available. A Salvage Scout and Restoration Specialist are both dorky little creatures that can sacrifice themselves to return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. And by the way, both have small enough mana values to be recovered from your graveyard with your Imperial Recovery unit. There's Ironsoul Enforcer. This is a 5-mana artifact creature that has, whenever it or a commander you control attacks, you get to return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now this is a little bit slow and expensive since it doesn't have haste, and Greasefang isn't really likely going to be attacking to trigger it, but it's still really good value, so we'll use it. And finally I've included Liessa, Forgotten Archangel. This is great for recovering our sacrificed vehicles, at least if that vehicle was crewed. Liessa has, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. Again, you'll trigger this whenever you sacrifice one of your vehicles, as long as it's a creature when you do so. Now the recurred vehicle will go back to your hand, which isn't any better than what Greasefang would do, but this is decent redundancy. Now Liessa also says if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead, so this is really great for turning off your opponent's graveyard strategies as well. So those are some of the ways that we're going to fill our graveyard with vehicles or sacrifice them for value after we reanimate them with Greasefang. And we've also got a few vehicle buffs and some redundant recursion effects. Next, let's talk about some of the other card draw, mana ramp, and removal spells that work well in this deck. Now for card draw, of course we'll use Skull Clamp, which we can equip to one of our crewed vehicles before we sacrifice it. We'll use Painseer, which has Inspired. When it becomes untapped, you reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand, and you lose life equal to its mana value. So Painseer is great for crewing vehicles, since that way you'll be able to easily tap it and get that Inspired trigger at the beginning of your next untap step. When it comes to mana ramp, we'll use our standard mana rocks. I'm not going to mention them all here, but as always you can see the link to the full deck list in the description. But I will mention Ebony Fly, because this 2 mana rock can also turn itself into a creature to help you crew your vehicles if you need it. It's not super reliable since it costs 4 mana to animate, and you don't know how big it will be since you need to roll a d6 to determine its power and toughness. But it's also just 2 mana ramp, so the floor of this card is still pretty good. Now for removal, I have Slaughter the Strong, which makes each player choose any number of creatures they control with power 4 or less and sacrifice the rest. This will leave Greasefang alone, and like any vehicles deck, we can just cast it before crewing our vehicles, so it won't touch them either. Austere Command can be used similarly. We can destroy all creatures with mana value 4 or greater, which leaves Greasefang alone again, and we can do this again before crewing any vehicles. Now I also like King Makar the Gold Cursed. This is another one with Inspired. When it untaps, you get to exile a target creature and make a gold token, which is kind of scary. King Makar often commands his own vehicles themed deck, so it's obviously a great fit in this deck as well. Now for lands, we'll use a decent number of lands that can become creatures and help us crew vehicles, like Mishra's Factory and Mutavault, which can become 2/2s for just 1 mana. A Blinkmoth Nexus can become a 1/1 for just 1 mana. There's the new Mech Hanger, which can pay 3 and tap to crew any of our vehicles all by itself. We've got Gaia Reach Sanitarium, which lets us discard vehicles into our graveyard to reanimate them with Greasefang. Sequestered Stash and Buried Ruin are more graveyard recursion for artifacts in our land slot. And then we've got Inventor's Fair, which can help us tutor an artifact out of our library. And that is the deck. Again, I didn't cover every card, but you can check out the link to the full deck list in the description. And for now, let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Greasefang Okiba Boss deck has an average mana value of 3.01. We have 15 vehicles in the deck, but again we're trying to focus on the best vehicles only, and especially ones that have some ETB or attack or combat damage trigger, so we can generate immediate value with them when we reanimate them with Greasefang. We have 10 cards that let us sacrifice our animated vehicles for value, so that Greasefang can animate them again for value the next turn. We have 8 cards that help us recover cards from our graveyard, in addition to our commander. Many of these recursion spells will get artifacts back from the graveyard, but there are some as well, like Ruthless Technomancer and Imperial Recovery Unit, that can recur creatures from the graveyard as well. And this deck has 12 card draw spells and 10 ramp spells. And finally, we've got 10 single target removal spells and 5 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $179.30 on tcgplayer.com. So that is Greasefang Okiba Boss. Like most vehicle decks, this deck aims to win primarily through combat damage. We're taking advantage of the fact that vehicles aren't creatures most of the time, and so we can use these selective board wipes that hurt our opponents while leaving our vehicles untouched. And combining that with Orzhov's excellent suite of single target removal, we have a lot of tools to keep our opponent's blockers out of the way and get our vehicles in for combat damage. Now these are pretty standard vehicle strategies, but in this deck we'll also use a lot of sacrifice and graveyard recursion effects to get additional value from our vehicles, which to be fair is pretty standard for Orzhov, but it isn't very common at all in comparison to other vehicle decks. And that graveyard recursion means we can also be more cavalier about attacking with our vehicles even if they'll die in combat, since we can more easily recur them from the graveyard to use again. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments what you think about Greasefang Okiba Boss. Or better yet, you can join the Commander's Beacon Discord server, where we discuss unconventional commander builds and strategies. Now, Kamikawa Neon Dynasty brought a lot of support for vehicles, including some potent vehicle commanders like Shorikai and Kotori, but hopefully I've convinced you that Greasefang is perhaps the most fun way to play vehicles in Commander. And finally, if you like this content, please hit that like button or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you want to further support the channel, check out our Patreon page. Patrons get to vote on upcoming content, among other things, and you can find the link to the Discord and the Patreon in the description. Anyways, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.